I've recently been getting back into Classic Who, mostly because of getting a whole heap of the collection box sets and rewatching that particular season included. Whilst doing that, I decided to rewatch all of 60s Who, as it's my favourite Classic Who decade, and there's no box sets for them yet because of the missing episodes. I also just wanted to give the missing episodes another go, as I struggled with Recon's first time round. I can safely say that I absolutely loved rewatching the Hartnell era, and missing episodes have gotten so much higher in my estimation. After finishing the Hartnell era, I really wanted to express my opinions on each story here on YouTube, so I decided to rank them all, especially as I have around 2 hot takes. Oh well, as I say, you can't have a good list unless you have at least 1 hot take. Actually, I don't say that, that's just something I made up right now. Before we do that, I need to clarify some things. Missing stories will be included, and the way I watched them was by watching the most recent Loose Cannon Recon for that particular story, instead of just listening to the audio, as I personally prefer recons to audio. The only exceptions to this were for the Daleks Master Plan and Marco Polo Part 1, as I instead watched brilliant reconstructions by Josh Snares, as well as Reign of Terror and 10th Planet, because they were officially animated by the BBC, and also Mission to the Unknown, as it was brilliantly recreated by the University of Central Lancashire and went on the official Doctor Who YouTube channel. Furthermore, this list will only include the 29 stories in the TV run for Hartnell's tenure. This means that An Adventure in Space and Time, as well as any of the multi-Doctor stories, won't be included. Furthermore, none of the Big Finish stuff with David Bradley will be included. Finally, this one's a bit more serious. Some of these stories have not aged well at all. These stories are a product of their time, so there is a fair share of racism in the stories. Most of the time the racism boils down to the use of blackface and yellowface, which is not good at all. So, to prevent me from having to talk about this when praising a story, I will leave a little note in the corner of the screen. There is one exception where I'll go more in depth on the racism, but we'll get to that. Obviously, racism is terrible, and I should clarify that when I praise a story with it featured, I'm still condemning the racism taken at the time, while simultaneously enjoying the story around it. I hope you understand, as I spent a long time trying to word that well. Now that I've got all that out of the way, let's move on to the list, as you can probably tell that this will be a long video. I mean, jeez!
Spoilers.
Come on, what else are you expecting? The Web Planet is my new least favourite story in all of Who. Even worse than In the Forest of the Shite. At least that story is over in a cool 45, whilst this takes 2.5 bloody hours. Just look at this story, and tell me that it doesn't look tacky as hell. For 1965, this was probably great, but it has not aged well at all. The scenery looks nice, but that's the only positive, which is completely overshadowed by the fact that this causes me physical pain to watch. Not only is it agonisingly long due to the plot lasting for 2 parts and being stretched to 6, but for some reason, the directors decided to put Vaseline on the camera, which just hurts my eyes. The biggest problem, however, are the Zabi beeps. They just cannot shut up. It's so grating to listen to for 6 parts. Just imagine trying to watch a story, and all you can hear from is I hope I never watch a classic serial which feels more like an endurance test than a story again. This is an easy 1 out of 10. It would be a 0 if the scenery didn't look quite nice. I hope the next story isn't so bad. As it is...
What is admittedly cinematic equivalent of watching paint dry.
Speak up, I can't hear you.
We have been speaking to each other.
No, wait, that's a compliment, because at least when you watch paint dry, you get a nicely painted room afterwards.
Despite being my second least favourite Hartnell, the Sensorites is still leaps and bounds better than the Web Planet. Whilst the Web Planet was a 1 out of 10, the Sensorites is a 4 out of 10. However, a 4 isn't really saying much, as this story is still ridiculously boring. Part 1 is brilliant though, due to building up a really interesting threat and keeping you guessing on what the threat could be, and the cliffhanger, whilst a bit silly, still works really well. However, when the Sensorites themselves show up, the story does get a bit less interesting, as the mystery is revealed to us. Also, Susan having psychic powers is something I'm really mixed on. On the one hand, it gives Susan something to do, as she usually just runs around screaming and crying over a sprained ankle. But now she's actually important to the plot. However, the problem is that it just sort of comes out of nowhere and is then promptly forgotten about when the story wraps up. Despite that, part 2 is still quite good. Gee, this story is quite good so far. I wonder how many more parts it's got. Yeah, 6 parts was way too long for this type of story. And as soon as the Doctor, Ian and Susan go down to the Sense Sphere and leave Barbara to give Jacqueline Hill a holiday, to allow Barbara to do something which I forgot, the story just continues to tumble down the hill of boringness. There's this one Sensorite who wants to make the humans look bad, as some of them took molybdenum, why is this so hard to say? Molybdenum, this element. Well, I think that was their plan, but I honestly can't remember, and I can't be asked to read the actual plot on TARDIS Wiki, as the story would still be really boring. Also, can I just talk about the fact that Part 5's title is inaccurate due to a kidnap not happening until the cliffhanger for the episode, so technically it doesn't happen until Part 6? Stop trying to make the story sound more interesting than it actually is. Yeah, this story is really boring.
They're savages, savages, barely even human. Savages, savages, drive them from our shore.
I honestly really wanted to like The Savages, as I adore Ian Stewart Black's other 2 stories, and Season 3 was a really good season for me, but this just didn't cut it. I have no idea whether part of why I wasn't much of a fan was because this story was missing, but I do have a feeling that an animation will help me see the story in a different light. That being said, I just wasn't too interested in the story as a whole. The only thing people seem to remember about the story is that it is Stephen's last appearance, and I can see why, as the story around it just isn't too interesting for me. The Elders draining the life supply from the people outside the city, aka the Savages, is a really good and dark premise, but I think it could have been executed better. I found myself tuning out of the story a lot, especially with the scenes in the city, as it mostly felt like walking up and down nice looking corridor, which we at least get to see as Tight Snap survive, and occasionally talking to people. However, any story to not make Dodo annoying at all is an achievement. In summary, the Savages tiptoed so the Macroterror could sprint, as the stories are quite similar due to the whole utopian society holding a dark secret. However, Macroterror is so much better. Yeah, that rhymed.
With rings on their fingers and bells on their toes, the girls come to Tombstone in their high silk hose. They'll dance on the tables or sing you a a tune for whatever's in your wallet at the Last Chance Saloon.
Quiz time! Guess how many times a version of Last Chance Saloon played in the Gunfighters? Feel free to guess in the comments and then see whether you got it right. I will give you 30 seconds to guess. And time is up. If you guessed 33 times, then you would be correct. Yes, it played 33 times. And the strangest part is that that's the best part of the Gunfighters. I was honestly shocked to realise that I was bored by this story. Yeah, I was. That's not to say the story is bad though. The Last Chance Saloon, whilst obviously overplayed, it's really fun and catchy, and I cheer every time it appears. The first part is absolute gold due to the Doctor getting his teeth removed by Doc Holliday after he stupidly thought it would be a good idea to eat one of the sweets by the Celestial Toymaker in the previous story. If you embrace the silliness, you may have a good time with this story, or you may despise it, who knows. I embraced the silliness, but just found the plot a bit dull. I'd say that the pros and cons balance each other out equally, as it is super funny in the first half, but the plot itself is quite dull, and historical inaccuracy definitely loses some points. I'd say that this story is bang on average, and it's the first 5 out of 10 story. Weird how an average story is in the bottom 5, but that just shows how great the Hartnell era is. Also, Dodo with a Gun is bae.
I Shrunk the Kids.
Planet of Giants is a story, I guess. It has a lot of great stuff about it though. The set design is impeccable, and having the TARDIS team shrunk down to
Roughly to the size of an inch.
and having to overcome everyday obstacles like a sink is honestly really fun to watch and very clever. However, the story itself is really dull. Basically, a bloke made a deadly insecticide which could potentially kill everyone, so another bloke killed him and took it before he gets arrested for murder or something. I honestly don't know, and don't care. It's as uninteresting as the Sensorites' plot, but at least Planet of Giants has a lot more good surrounding the plot, and I take giant cats and sinks over spaceships and boardrooms any day. If the main plot was better and more interesting, then this story would be so much more than what it is. Even with the creative concepts, there are a lot of long drawn out scenes which are quite boring, and Susan is still annoying. Thank God they cut this down to 3 parts, as it would be a lot lower with 4. Also, 2020 be like...
I told them all, I am the master.
The Space Museum just reeks of missed potential. A museum in space with a bunch of alien artifacts sounds awesome and could lead to a lot of references, but they only included the Dalek. I wish maybe they could have had something to do with the Sensorites or Coquillion or a Zarbi, just as nice little odds to the past few stories. But most of the stuff is new instead, but still quite cool. I actually have a feeling that Dalek was inspired by this story due to Van Staten having a bunch of alien artifacts in his museum, like the Cyberman head and the Slovene arm. Obviously RTD had more references to work with in 2005 compared to the Space Museum in 1965, so I can give the Space Museum a pass on that one. What I can't give it a pass on, however, is everything after Part 1. Part 1 is absolutely phenomenal and one of the best opening episodes for any story. It builds up a really intriguing mystery and keeps you guessing, and that glass reform effect looks great for 1965, and it also ends on a brilliant cliffhanger. Furthermore, the Doctor hiding in the Dalek in Part 2 is amazing, and you will not convince me otherwise. However, when the sidecast can talk, and the main plot is now about a revolution or something, my intrigue in the story plummets. I wish the story could have been about exploring the museum, and then having to stop external forces from interfering with the TARDIS team's older selves to prevent the terrible outcome they saw. Go to town with the timey-wiminess, as I really like that, and this could have been a really cool early example of it in the show's history. But instead, we got a really dull sidecast and a fairly uninteresting plot. However, no 2014 fans, this story is not that bad. It's average, yes, but it's not worse than some of these stinkers.
First!
Part 1 of An Unearthly Child is phenomenal and one of the best episodes in all of Who. It is required viewing for every Whovian due to being the first ever episode and just being a good episode to boot. That being said though, caveman politics is boring as hell. I know it's a common thing to say, but it's true. Part 1 is phenomenal due to a great tone and great showcasing of all the characters, but the other 3 parts are really lacking and just really dull and boring. Part 1 honestly feels like a completely separate story due to a different setting, different tone, and different, quality. Alas, it is officially one story, so I have to consider it as one for this ranking, and the caveman stuff really lets the rest down. If Part 1 was on its own, then it would easily be in the top 3, but now it is in the bottom 7. Zara the caveman trying to get his fire is really not interesting, and parts 2 to 4 on their own would easily be in the bottom 3. This is a really weird story to talk about due to the massive shift in quality, and also because of its importance due to being the first story ever. But the best way to describe it is Part 1 Bay and the rest is just bleh.
I'm gonna spend my Christmas with a Dalek and hug him underneath the mistletoe.
I did say at the start that I had 2 hot takes. This is the first. The Dalek invasion of Earth is really overrated and only average. That being said, there are some good moments which allow the story to become the first 6 out of 10 story. The Daleks are a great threat in this because they have officially succeeded and they're just happily roaming around London doing Nazi salutes. Yeah, if you didn't realise that the Daleks are based off the Nazis, then it's pretty obvious now. There's a lot of great dark moments, and I always like ghost towns and stuff as they feel really creepy, like in 28 Days Later for instance. And, of course, there's the goodbye speech to Susan, which is just as good as everyone says it is. Whilst not my favourite Hartnell scene, it is definitely my second, and I don't even like Susan. That's how you know they did a good job. However, once again, those 6 episodes let down the story. I was bored on multiple occasions, and keep in mind that I tried to love this story, but kept tuning out at quite a lot of moments. I also just wasn't invested in any of the side casts, which isn't great as they take up a lot of the screen time when Ian and the Doctor are gone. Also, it does feel iffy that Susan left the TARDIS for a man she just met. Susan should have stayed with someone else who I will talk about later. All in all, the Cushing film with Bernie Cribbins was way better.
Doctor, I don't understand this at all.
Yes, I prefer Galaxy 4 to the Dalek invasion of Earth. I'm as shocked as you. Yes, it is obvious that Stephen's lines were meant to be for Ian and Barbara. Yes, the Chumleys are silly. Yes, the audio on the Loose Cannon Recon is, well...
The planet's due to explode in less than 5 hours. I fully appreciate that fact, young man.
However, I don't care. This story is just fun. The Chumleys are indeed silly, but they're also fun to watch roam around. I also like the whole don't judge a book by its cover part of the story, as the beautiful Dravins are the bad guys, whilst the disgusting Reals are the good guys. I just think it's a nice change of pace. You would think that I would be annoyed with the Chumley noises, as I hate the Zabi ones, but they don't feel as grating on me, to be honest. The biggest problems with this story is that it is a bit slow to get going, and the audio quality is very distracting. I unfortunately don't have the audio CD or the updated cut down recon on the Aztecs DVD for this story, so I haven't been able to experience the story with better audio quality, but I really hope that the rumours of an animation are true, as I would love to see it. It may get better, who knows?
Kaboom!
The Edge of Destruction is surprisingly dull for a two-parter. Don't get me wrong, there is a lot, and I mean a lot, of good parts about it. But overall, it was pretty mediocre. And the fact that everything was caused by a jammed button really doesn't help matters. That being said, however, it is a great story for our four main characters, especially Hartnell. Now, most people who don't bother to watch Hartnell or pass this story write him off as the mean and grumpy doctor, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The clip I played from the Space Museum proves it. The whole point of the first three stories, aka the beginning box set, is to gradually turn the first Doctor from mean and grumpy to soft but stern. And this story is the finale of that, as the Doctor finally realises the error of his ways, and blindly accusing Barbara makes him realise that he hurt her and was way too rude on her and Chesterton. It's a great little character arc which gets built upon throughout his era. That being said, there are still a lot of fairly dull scenes, and the fact that this is set entirely inside the TARDIS would be cool, but it honestly just feels stale. Would have been cool if we got to see some rooms, especially in 1964, but that unfortunately wasn't the case. Even though I'd still give it a 6 out of 10, it is just barely not a 7, mostly because the ending does let the story down. However, I'd still give the story a pretty good mark of a high 6, mostly because the character stuff is still really good.
But you can't rewrite history, not one line!
2,000 years later.
The laws of time are mine, and they will obey me!
And here's hot take number 2. The Aztecs is one of the most overrated stories in Who. Right up there with the Fires of Pompeii, the Library two-parter, and The Girl Who Waited. Sorry, okay. I just didn't click with this one like other people. Don't get me wrong, it is good. It is the first 7 out of 10 story on this list, which is the most common rating I gave the Hartnell stories. I might as well start with the positives. This is Barbara's best story, and I probably won't need to explain why, but I'll do it anyway. Barbara is believed to be a goddess and considers rewriting history by preventing the Aztecs' cruel sacrifices, so they will be able to live on. Obviously, the Doctor says she can't do that, but Barbara disagrees. That is an absolutely brilliant conflict, and it does show up in later episodes, but this is the originator of it, and it's great. Barbara challenging the Doctor is what I like to see. Also, I love that the Doctor gets accidentally engaged. It's great. However, my big problem with the story is that I found myself bored throughout a lot of it. Whilst the sets do look nice, I do get bored of them as they appear quite a lot, and I'm not too interested in the side characters, especially when they're just standing around and talking to other people. I kept finding myself trying to find a hook to get me back into the story, but I just couldn't find it. Also, I feel like the time travel moral just sort of fizzles out after part 2. My biggest problem, however, is the villain, Tloxtol. I don't know how to say it. That guy. I just don't like him. I find him really annoying, as all he seems to do is run around going, "She is a false goddess," and he honestly just really grates on me. Also, the fact that TARDIS team could easily just leave but the TARDIS is blocked by a heavy door is kinda dumb. That being said, the main Barbara stuff is good enough to secure this a 7 out of 10 rating. It's just not as good as people say it is. The Aztecs is overrated.
To the guillotine!
So, yeah. The Reign of Terror was a very enjoyable watch. I heard from most people that it was a fairly mediocre story, but I actually quite liked it. To be fair though, I heard that said about most pure historicals, and judging by the fact that only 2 pure historicals on this list are lower than a 7, I think it's fair to say that I like me some pure historicals. First off, the Doctor playing dress up is awesome, and every time it's on screen I am just drawn to it. I also just generally really like the first half of the story. Part 1's cliffhanger is literally the Doctor trapped in a burning building whilst everyone else is taken to Paris in the midst of the French Revolution. That is nail-biting stuff right there. I also like that the Doctor has to traverse his way to Paris on his own, and we get a lot of nice scenery. I also like the side plot in the midst of Part 2, although I did find this shot a bit weird. However, the problem with the story is that there is a lot of slow moments due to the characters being trapped in cells a lot, especially Susan. There is also a lot of talky scenes, which I get is important for this type of story, because it is a very political, historical story, so it does make sense, but the 6-part length does indeed hinder the story compared to other pure historicals I like. I do still really like the start though, so it still secures its 7 out of 10 rating. Also, I hate to bring it up, but this story has by far the weakest animation for a missing episode, and that includes the Web of Fear teasers we got. And that's mostly due to the constant jump cuts, as you can see right here. Yeah, the Reign of Terror animation be like,
it's probably just a chill.
It's probably just a chill. The arc seriously feels like it's 2 stories in one, and I really like that about that serial. It's very unique and makes things interesting in the second half. However, I feel like neither of the halves fully land. There's some fun to be had here, and I was rarely bored, but it's not perfect. In the first half, Dodo's cold nearly wipes out humanity. Literally! And in the second, the former slaves, the Monois, are keeping the humans as slaves and plan to take over our planet and blow up all the humans in the process. The problem with the first half is that I'm not a fan of trials and stuff, especially when you know the people are innocent, and I just find it kind of tedious. The second half is a lot better though, as I honestly quite like the Monoids. Yes, they look silly, but I don't care. They're just fun. Part 4 is very intense due to a bomb about to explode, and I just like the way the 2 separate stories tie together. However, Dodo is her most annoying here. Now, despite what I've said before in like the Savages segment, however, any story to not make Dodo annoying at all is an achievement. I don't think Dodo's actually as bad as people say she is. In fact, hot take here, I prefer her to Susan. That's right, I prefer Dodo Chaplet to Susan Foreman. So, yeah, I don't think she's that bad. However, even I'll admit that she is really annoying in this story, by quite a bit. But at least the Doctor and Stephen are quite good. Whilst the story definitely has more flaws than the last 2, I enjoy it a lot more, and would rather rewatch it. It's also less boring in my opinion, due to being a nice 4 parts, unlike Reign of Terror, which was 6 parts. Basically, what I'm trying to say about this story is, bring back the Monois, please!
Do it. Crusade! They did many crusades, some of which almost didn't fail.
If the Crusade didn't have 2 surviving episodes, then it would most likely be lower, as just like Galaxy 4, the audio quality isn't the best. It isn't as poor as Galaxy 4's though, but it is definitely kind of distracting. As a story though, it's quite good. I really like King Richard as a character, and anything with Jean Marsh in it is always great. Also, why does everyone forget that Ian was knighted and was almost eaten by ants in this story? Not what I was expecting from this type of story, but it's still good. The problem, however, is that this story does get very complicated. I know the Crusade is quite a complicated period in history, but I still struggle with the second half especially. Maybe if I rewatch the story I'll understand it better, but I may just wait until a high quality recon is released, as I doubt an animation will come anytime soon. Overall, enjoyable, but the complicated plot did take me a little bit out of the story. Also, was definitely a wise move of Bill Hartnell to ask to remove the supposed incestuous scenes between Richard and his sister, because yeah, I've had enough of sci-fi incest.
Disgusting! You Trojan dog!
Another 7 out of 10 pure historical. The Mythmakers is definitely one of the more underrated pure historicals. There's a lot of good to be had here, from the impressive Trojan horse model, to the sets. Wait, we don't know what the sets look like as placemats that survive for this story. I just like the story, okay? I always like it when the Doctor inadvertently causes a historical event, and in this case, the Doctor ends up giving the idea for the Trojan horse. I also think Vicky is quite good, until the ending, but we'll get to that. This story was nice and simple compared to the Crusade, so that gives it the edge over that, and I wasn't bored by the story much. However, Vicky's exit was absolutely atrocious. For such a long-running and great character, she deserved a great exit, but nope! She just sort of leaves with a man without giving a proper goodbye, and then Katarina replaced her and tried to reach the place of perfection. There's definitely some other bad exits in the show, but at least the characters said goodbye. -1, but we'll get to that. Vicky didn't even say a proper goodbye. Furthermore, I've completely forgotten what Stephen did this story, aside from be convicted of a spy in Troy like Vicky. All in all though, a simple story with a bad companion exit, nothing too special but still enjoyable. Stan Cyclops though, as he's the best character. Also, why does this screenshot look like Stephen got kicked in the balls?
Yar har fiddle-dee-dee, being a pirate is a wretched thing. Do what you want cause a pirate is free. You are a pirate.
And the award for the most underrated Hartnell story goes to... The Smugglers? Yes, The Smugglers. The reason I consider it to be underrated is because no one talks about it, unlike other quote-unquote underrated Hartnell stories like The Rescue. In fact, a lot of people dislike this story, which I definitely disagree with. I think this is a really intriguing pure historical story. It's Ben and Polly's first trip in the TARDIS, and they're definitely the best part. I think that Ben and Polly deserve more love, as they're honestly brilliant in every story they're in, and this is no exception. I also just really like Cherub. I have no idea whether part of that may be because he said yeet though.
Not from such a black pig as ye!
Most people consider this story to be boring, and while there are boring moments like in a lot of stories, I found myself really intrigued at the pirate plot, as well as what's happening in each scene. I will say that I generally prefer more gritty historicals to comedy ones, as the comedy ones aren't always my cup of tea, but The Smugglers can get quite dark sometimes. I mean, the Australia censor clips show off some of the story's more darker moments. The reason this story isn't higher is because there are a few boring moments, especially the talkie scenes, and I was a bit confused by the ending, but I feel like an animation will definitely help in those aspects. I'll probably do an updated Hartnell ranking if all the stories get animated, which I highly doubt, or in a few years when general opinions have changed and there's a chance that this story may place higher. Basically, what I'm trying to say with The Smugglers is that I simp for Cherub.
Yeet!
Rotten Romans.
The Romans is such a fun story. That being said, it's not my style of comedy, as we'll get to that later. I know I just said I prefer gritty historicals to comedy ones, but this is the exception, and it is definitely a lot of fun, and the main cast look like they're having such a good time. There are so many cute character moments.
No ice, I'm afraid.
Well, there's some in the fridge.
Ah.
And also, Hartnell beating up his assassin is just peak who because of course it is. As I said before, I love it when the Doctor inadvertently causes a historical event, and in this story, the Doctor, albeit accidentally, gives Emperor Nero the idea to burn down Rome. Speaking of Nero, I would normally be annoyed by villains like him, but I honestly don't mind him. I'm not a fan of him chasing Barbara around though. Whilst the story isn't entirely my style of comedy, it doesn't mean that I don't find it funny, as I laugh so many times, like at the 2 scenes I mentioned earlier, as well as when the Doctor played the liar.
He's all right, but he's not all that good.
Ian and Barbara are great as usual, but I love them even more here, and for her second ever story, Vicky is very good. Hartnell looks like he was having an absolute blast when filming this. Also, the sets are amazing and look spot on with Roman architecture. I do feel like the story slows down around the middle though, and whilst Nero is fun, I don't find him particularly threatening. Still, this is a fun, enjoyable watch, but it doesn't have anything too special that pushes it above a 7. Okay, that comes close.
Just imagine trying to tackle one of them geezers with a screwdriver.
Carlos! Seal you with your ice tools! Olga!
The 10th Planet is a good story. However, it isn't automatically a masterpiece just because it's the first Cyberman story and the first Regeneration story. I fully understand this story's importance. Without the 10th Planet, we wouldn't be here today, as we wouldn't have had the concept of regeneration. Furthermore, the Cybermen were really the only 60s villain to rival the Daleks in popularity and familiarity with the public. Screw the Chumleys, the Zarbi, and I still love you Monoids, but the Cybermen were the only Dalek replacement which succeeded. That being said though, I think the original Mondasian Cybermen were done better in World Enough in Time. Don't get me wrong, they are creepy as hell here, but they only play a role in 2 out of 4 of the parts, and the rest of the time, the villain is this annoying general dude. I really don't like villains like this, where they're only being villainous because they won't listen to what other people say, and are so hell-bent on one ideology, and it's just annoying to watch. That dude is definitely what's holding this story back from being higher than a 7, because the pros would otherwise be very strong. There are a few other problems, such as the Doctor not doing much even outside of Part 3 when Hartnell couldn't make it that week. And, well, the only thing Polly did was make the coffee.
Well, I could make some coffee or something.
I know there was an explanation for the coffee, but compared to Ben, who single-handedly stopped the Z-bomb by embracing his inner Bruce Willis, defusing the bomb, and getting knocked out in the process, Polly's role is definitely lacking. Not to mention that Ben was the first one to defeat a Cyberman, and that helped everyone else defeat them. All that being said though, this is still a very good story, and definitely the best of the 7 out of 10s. This Cyberman crotch shot is still weird though.
Who are you people?
Mission to the Unknown is such a weird one in the show's history. It's the only classic story to have one singular episode, which is only 25 minutes long, and it is the only story in all of Who to not feature the Doctor, the TARDIS, or any companions. This story was mostly made as a prequel to the 12-part epic The Daleks' Masterplan, as well as being a pitch by Terry Nation for a potential Dalek spin-off which never came to be. For how unique this story is, I think it works quite well. It's not the greatest story ever made, but it's an intriguing watch, and I think that just edges this story to an 8 out of 10. I think that Mark Corey is a very interesting protagonist, and I wish we got to see more of him. Like, what if he was a sort of pseudo-companion in the Daleks' master plan, like Brett? There's so much I want to know about this guy. Big Finish, knock your socks off. I feel like the Daleks have a great menace to them, especially at the ending, when, despite his best efforts, Mark ends up being killed by the Daleks, and he doesn't know whether he delivered the message warning Earth about the Daleks. That message cleverly ends up being brought back in the Daleks' master plan, which I think was definitely a nice touch. Also, the Varga pants are a great concept and should be brought back in the TV show, as they did appear in the adventure games. The main problem with this story is that you can only do so much in 25 minutes, and I just wanted more from it. If Big Finish does a Mark Corey box set starring the guy who played him in the recreation, then I will be happy, as he did a brilliant job in that recreation. In fact, if you haven't seen the recreation, watch it now. Just stop this video, watch it now. It's all on YouTube. I'll leave a link.
Among Us!
Not among us!
Alright, now it's time for the top 10. These are the big ones now. The other 8 out of 10s and above.
Let's get down to business.
And British robots. Ask your nerd friends.
The Daleks is an absolutely fascinating watch, for many reasons. First off, for our first go at the Daleks, I think that Terry Nation, Verity Lambert and everyone else who worked on this pulled them off brilliantly, and I can see why they were an absolute smash hit with audiences in the 60s. I love how these Daleks can only remain in the city due to them being so early in development, as it shows how threatening they are despite being stuck in the confines of one area. Furthermore, the Part 1 cliffhanger is iconic for a reason, and it is just so creepy. The Daleks aren't the only intriguing part of the story though, as seeing the dynamic of our four leads and how differently the Doctor used to be is just fascinating. This story shows the peak of how rude and egocentric the first Doctor was in the beginning box set, as he purposefully removed the fluid lick from the TARDIS just so he could explore the city on Skaro. This comes back to bite him later though, as when everyone has escaped the city in part 4, it looks like the story is about to end, when suddenly, whoops, I dropped the mercury we need for the fluid link, which I purposely removed and now we can't leave. This means that the Thals had to join the Travellers to go back to the city, and it ends up getting the leader killed. Hey, it's me from the future here, just coming in to tell you that I made a mistake. The Thal leader wasn't killed because the Doctor dropped the fluid link and they went back in the sea. No, the Thal was killed because the Thals thought that the Daleks wanted to help them, so they went by their own merit, so it isn't technically the Doctor's fault, but yeah. See, we all make mistakes. Speaking of the Thals, while I do quite like them, when they become the focus in the second half of the story, it really slows down. The first half is absolutely brilliant and intense, and part 4 is definitely my favourite, as the Travellers have to escape the Dalek city. They destroy an elevator, and Ian gets inside a Dalek casing, and it is infinitely better than when Clara did it in The Witch's Familiar. However, everyone trying to get back into the city isn't too interesting, and part 6 especially is really boring. But part 7 is good, and the rest of the story is amazing, so that keeps this story as an 8 out of 10, but just barely in the top 10. Also, can this story be a PSA on why not to do drugs, as the Daleks literally took some drugs, and this is what happened.
And if you do drugs, you go to hell before you die.
A rescue helicopter has fallen into the rescue helicopter in Lego City. Hey!
The rescue is so good, you guys, why did none of y'all tell me? This story was mostly made to replace Susan with a new, and superior, companion Vicky. However, it is such an enjoyable watch, and it's a very easy watch as well, as it's only 2 parts long. It is also really funny, specifically at the scene where Ian and Barbara are mocking the Doctor for having a nap and calling him old, and the Doctor comes out saying,
"Remember, I can hear what you're saying."
It's great. Vicky also makes a great first impression, She is very likable in the story, and you feel bad for her, as her parents were killed in an explosion caused by Ququillian. Speaking of Ququillian, whilst he isn't anything too special, he's quite a dark concept, as he literally murdered hundreds of people just to cover his own ass from jail, and Vicky only survived because she was sick. Ququillian even tried to kill Ian and Barbara, but luckily both survived. I really like the trials and tribulations that the Doctor and Ian have to go through to get to the crashed spaceship where Vicky and Barbara were. While some of the creatures do look a bit shoddy, and I will never forgive Barbara for killing one of them, this is still a great watch. There is only so much you can do for a story like this, and it didn't blow me away, so that's why I wouldn't put it higher, but I would probably jump to rewatch it quicker than some of the stories later in this list. It's kind of like how I prefer Turn Left to Partners in Crime, but would much rather rewatch Partners in Crime because it's more fun and less depressing. Speaking of fun stories...
Toss me my keys! I said my keys.
I thought you said printer!
Why the fuck would I say printer?
The Keys of Marinus may look cheap on the surface, but it is ridiculously enjoyable and endlessly rewatchable. Despite being 6 parts long, nothing about it feels boring due to location changing almost every part. In part 1 we're on an island, in part 2 we're in what seems to be a nice city, in part 3 we're in a jungle, in part 4 we're in the mountains, and in part 5 and 6 we're in a courtroom before returning to the island. I do tend to struggle with 6 parts, I'm not going to deny that. But my favourite ones are the ones which change a setting or an aspect to keep the story interesting. Whether this is seeing new locations or introducing new threats, it keeps me interested. Obviously, it's not a perfect rule, as Colony in Space visits new locations, yet I find it really boring. And on the other hand, Fury from the Deep is mostly set in one location, yet I adore it. What I'm trying to say is that Keys of Marinus did 6 part as well. Another reason why I really like this story is that I've always really liked fetch quests, and I don't know why. There are a few problems with this story though, which keeps this as an, albeit very high, 8 out of 10. The main issue is the board, as they do nothing, and the ending also feels really rushed. Also, I'm never a big fan of a character just leaving in the middle of a story for no reason because the actor wanted a holiday, and that happened with the first Doctor from the end of part 2 to part 5. I'm not trying to say that Hartnell shouldn't have had a holiday, but the explanation felt a bit cheap. At least it gives Ian and Barbara time to shine, and it helps us really connect with the sidecast, as I really like them in this story, which is quite a rarity. Overall, this is a really fun story with not the best ending, but still endlessly rewatchable, with more to keep me hooked over the rescue.
Did you hear that?
Yes.
Let the games begin.
I absolutely adore the Celestial Toymaker, and it is our first 9 out of 10. However, this is the story which I said I would go more in depth on the racism for. The reason is because it's kind of complicated to explain in a caption in the corner. Firstly, they say the N-word. I don't think I need to go more in depth on that, but if you're curious, they say it in the Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo rhyme, and they replace tiger with that word. It's just if you're curious. However, the other racial problem is a bit more complicated. It's the fact that the Toymaker is called the Celestial Toymaker and is wearing Mandarin clothes. That may sound weird to focus on, as celestial just means something from space. However, in the 60s, many people used the word celestial as a slur against Chinese people. The fact that the Toymaker wore Mandarin clothes and was called celestial definitely has racial intentions. This racial implication is definitely not good, and that, plus the N-word, does make me more uncomfortable compared to blackface and yellowface in other stories. So that's why this story is only a 9 out of 10. As I said before, this is a very complicated and serious subject, which I tried my best to word, and I mostly went into detail to help educate some people. Hope you understand. Now that I've talked about the elephant in the room, I still adore this story in almost every other way. The games are super creative and fun to watch. Well, I say watch, but unfortunately this story is missing, so I have to imagine it. Which is kind of hard to do for a visual story when you only have pictures and captions for guides. Part 3 was definitely the hardest to understand due to everyone dancing. However, if you have a good imagination like me, then you may be able to enjoy it. At least Part 4 survives though. Also, while she's not perfect, I really like Dodo in this story, and this may be my favourite story from her outside of The Massacre on the War Machines. I also think that Steven is really good, as both Dodo and Steven are able to shine because the Doctor is missing throughout the story. The reason for this is because he has to play the really confusing Trilogic game with the Toymaker. I'm still trying to figure out what the rules of the game actually are, but it's still really interesting to watch. And the reason why Hartnell was invisible throughout most of the story was because poor Bill Hartnell really needed a holiday. He was really struggling with his health at this point, so I think that's fair enough. And also, the story explanation makes a lot more sense than, say, the Keys of Marinus. But it isn't perfect that the Doctor is just randomly invisible besides a floating hand, but hey. Also, I did admittedly find the ending a bit quick and confusing, but aside from that, this story was very gripping and intriguing. I even loved Part 3, where it felt like a pantomime, with two Cockneys going on about "me finest China." I apologise to any Cockney viewers. This story is just fun more than anything else, as well as being intense, and Michael Gough is brilliant as the Toymaker himself. Whilst the flaws in this story are definitely large, the rest of this story is so good that it's able to stay in the top 10. Such a great story.
Catholic, Protestant, Catholic, Protestant, Catholic, Protestant, Catholic, Protestant, Catholic, Protestant.
Remember how I said that I found the Crusade too complicated? Well, the Massacre has the same problem, but even more so. Yet somehow, the story is so good that I honestly don't even care. This is by far Steven's best story, as he is absolutely incredible here, due to being forced in with the Protestants and knowing that they're all going to be massacred, yet he can't do anything about it because he can't change history. It's a really dark story, and the story is so bleak, and it really pushed the boundaries for Saturday evening. After the Doctor and Steven are forced to leave Paris, as well as leaving a young girl behind to die, we get this 2-minute long scene of just pictures showing the St. Bartholomew's Eve massacre. And it's absolutely brutal to watch, and it just left my jaw on the floor. Obviously, Steven is pissed, so he leaves the TARDIS, and the First Doctor is now alone for the first time in a while. And he gives his best moment in his tenure, where he's thinking about his previous companions, and he even considers returning home for the very first time. It's a really powerful and touching scene, and I really hope it gets recovered or even animated. It's a brilliant scene, and Steven's exit is a brilliant one. That was until he showed up again 2 minutes later alongside Dodo and sticks around for another 4 stories. Whilst the scene itself is definitely the best First Doctor scene, it is such a shame that it is kind of undermined, like how that amazing speech in Rings of Back 10 was undermined by a freaking leaf. The very end is what's letting this story down, as it does sting a bit. Not to mention that its complexity is a bit of a downside. Furthermore, the Doctor barely does anything. However, William Hartnell as the Abbot is very good and really intriguing to watch. I do wish we got some Dr. Abbott interactions a la Enemy of the World, but it's still very good. Overall though, a great character piece with some really dark moments, as well as the best First Doctor scene, which just misses out on a 10 out of 10 due to the scene being undermined as well as being a bit complicated. A very good story, and the loose cannon recon is absolutely beautiful, and it made me forget I was even watching a recon. That's some high praise right there.
What do you mean, maybe? What do you think it is, a space helmet for a cow?
How did the Time Meddler get pseudo-historicals right on the first go? In case you don't know what a pseudo-historical is, it's a historical story with heavy sci-fi elements. Some examples in the modern series are things like The Empty Child, Vincent the Doctor, and The Flight of Pompeii, to name just a few. You've probably heard me call some stories pure historicals, and I should probably have mentioned what I mean by that, but basically they're historical stories with no sci-fi elements at all besides the TARDIS, and they were discontinued after the Highlanders, unless you count Black Orchid, which I kind of don't because it's still entirely fictional. Whilst I do like pure historicals more than other people, I much prefer pseudo-historicals, and The Time Meddler is no exception. The meddling monk is absolutely incredible and a brilliant villain, and it's honestly surprising that he hasn't come back in the TV show, especially because he is another Time Lord. I also think that this is Vicky's best story, as she is basically teaching Stephen everything he needs to know about the TARDIS, because she has more experience, as, well, this is Stephen's first proper story. The Doctor is also brilliant in this story. Not only is the line I played earlier his funniest moment, but he's also really clever, and defeats the monk by outwitting him and shrieking his TARDIS. Another reason I love this story is because I've always been fascinated with 1066, so seeing a story delve into that particular year and show a potential future outcome if just one thing was different was really interesting for me. I will say that this story just misses out on being a 10 due to the middle feeling quite slow for me, but there's so many twists and turns to keep me hooked even on a rewatch. Overall, a brilliant story I can't recommend enough. Wait, why does the Viking helmet have horns? This is historically inaccurate! 0 out of 10, you're as bad as the gunfighters in terms of historical accuracy.
You should be ashamed of yourselves!
Okay, so here's the tier list, starting with the bad stories, which are 4 out of 10s and below. And then you've got your fairly average stories, which are your 5 to 6 out of 10s. Then we got the good stories, which are your 7 out of 10s, followed by the 8 out of 10 great stories. And finally, the fantastic stories, which are 9 out of 10. Where's this accent coming from? What? Then, at the top, we have the 10 out of 10 masterpieces. These final 4 stories are all absolutely incredible in completely different ways, and I recommend all of them, as they are some of my favourites in all of Who. Let's begin talking about them.
We're in the endgame now.
Marco. Polo.
You know that you've made some incredible stories where Marco Polo is the weakest of the masterpieces. I adore this story in almost every way, from the beautiful sets and music, to the brilliantly written character of Marco Polo, to the plot which keeps my attention throughout 7 parts, and most importantly of all, the wonderful character piece this story presents. The plot may sound boring on the surface, as it's basically just the TARDIS team and Marco Polo slowly trudging across Cathay for 7 episodes. However, this story is so much more interesting than that. First of all, Marco Polo is tied with Vincent van Gogh, I still don't know how to pronounce it, as the best historical figure we've had in Who, due to the fact that instead of joining with our heroes, he is essentially a secondary villain to Totaka the Warlord, yet he isn't evil at the same time. He's more of an anti-hero due to the fact that he wants to give the Doctor's caravan, aka the TARDIS, to mighty Kublai Khan, and won't let the Doctor leave, and essentially keeps the TARDIS team as prisoners, yet you still sympathise with Marco due to his reasoning, as he's only doing all this in exchange for the Khan's approval to let him go back home to Venice. I also think the idea to have the journey told by Marco through diary entries was a brilliant decision, and really unique for this type of story, but still thematic. My deepest respects go to Mark Eden for being able to play this character so well, because he sadly passed away at the start of this year. I actually heard about the news right after I finished watching this story, so I was quite shocked and upset to hear it. Speaking of villains, the true villain of the story is Totaka the Warlord, and he is a really interesting villain to watch, as he is in disguise throughout most of the story. Whilst the audience knows that he's a bad guy, the characters don't, so you're left wondering what he'll do next, like cutting the water supply to try and kill Marco and the Travellers due to dehydration. His ultimate goal is to kill the Khan, and he will stop at nothing. The best part about this story, however, is the relationship between Susan and Ping Cho. These two are so cute to watch together, and after seeing their relationship grow, I wouldn't be surprised if John Lucarotti or Waris Hussein included some lesbian undertones, as these two are far more convincing than Susan and David ever was. Any scene with them in is a joy to watch. The rest of the TARDIS team are just as great as always, but Susan is the real star of the show, and this is our best story by far. The only reason this story is the quote-unquote weakest of the masterpieces is because when the travellers arrive at Kublai Khan's court, the story does lose a bit of its interest as the journey is over, but only a little bit of it, because it's still interesting to see what Tegana might do, as well as the Doctor having to win the TARDIS back through a game of backgammon. That's interesting to watch. Overall, this is an absolute must-watch if you're able to enjoy recons, because sadly, this story is entirely missing. This is the story I want recovered the most, minus the important ones, because I want to be able to see the stunning scenery, as we can only get a glimpse of it through telesnaps and a lot of colour photos. I hope we can find at least one episode of this story, and it seems likely as there were 9 prints made. Fingers crossed it could happen eventually, but doubt it still. Also, when I said this was Susan's best story, I never said she was perfect.
And his real name is Doctor Who.
I love Marco Polo as a character piece. I love the War Machines for completely different reasons. As a character piece, it's terrible, with Dodo having a pretty infamous send-off due to leaving halfway through the story due to a migraine and never coming back.
She says she's feeling much better and she'd like to stay here in London, and she sent you her love.
However, Dodo's loss is made up in spades due to Ben and Polly's presence. I've already said that I love these two, and this story is absolutely no exception. It's great seeing how the two meet for the first time, especially after seeing their other stories, because whilst Ian and Barbara already knew each other beforehand, we actually get to see Ben and Polly meet here, and it's quite interesting to see. Ben is an absolute badass here due to essentially being a spy, and Polly is really interesting to watch as she is hypnotised throughout part of the story. It is an absolute crime that this is the pair's only fully surviving story, not including animations. It's really weird when you say it out loud, but it's true. Whilst the character stuff isn't perfect, I adore this story because of something else. The gripping story and threatening villain. Wotan, or as it's pronounced, Votan, is the villain, and it is way ahead of its time, and creepy as hell. Artificial intelligence surpassing human intelligence and trying to take over the world is a much greater fear now than it was in the 60s, yet that just makes the story even more timeless and aged like fine wine. All of the quote-unquote human villains weren't even villains at all, as they were just hypnotized. The villain is the computer Votan and nothing else, as it was the one who made people build the war machines, and it really shows Votan's power because it was able to do that. The concept alone is really creepy, but whenever Votan speaks, it sends shivers down my spine and gives me goosebumps. Talk about an effective part 1 cliffhanger, as Votan asks in a creepy, whispery voice that the Doctor is required, and also annoys every Modern Who fan at the same time. Speaking of cliffhangers, the Part 3 cliffhanger is iconic for a reason, as it is one of the first Doctor's best moments. Whilst everyone else runs away from the indestructible war machine, the Doctor stands firm and stands up to that metal bastard. That is a badass Doctor moment right there, and the Doctor didn't even say anything. Speaking of the Doctor, I will say that he didn't do too much in the story, but I'd say he did enough that I still enjoyed him. But Ben and Polly are the real stars of the show. Overall, whilst one companion got a bad exit, 2 more got an amazing introduction. The Doctor became a badass, and the villain is one of the creepiest and most relevant villains we've ever had. Unlike Marco Polo, which is entirely missing, this story is almost fully surviving and available on DVD and BritBox, so I cannot recommend this story enough. If you want a great Hartnell story, watch this. You won't regret it. Also, this was me in lockdown.
The chase is on.
It probably shocked a lot of you that The Chase is number 2 on this list, and it kinda shocked me too, but I just can't get over how fun and rewatchable this story is, whilst having some legitimately great moments. I said previously that The Romans wasn't exactly my style of comedy. The Chase, on the other hand, is, and I will proudly call it the funniest story in Who. My style of comedy tends to be the really bonkers and kinda silly kind. It's the reason why I adore all of these films, but aren't as fussed on rom-coms or talk shows. The Chase is the definition of bonkers. Not only does the story open with Ian dad dancing to the Beatles playing Ticket to Ride, but we also have this gem of a line.
What's that awful noise?
I beg your pardon, awful noise. That's a way to talk about my singing.
Then the Daleks rock up. Everyone meets Morton Drill, played by Peter Purves, in the Empire State, and he's just amazing. I love him so much. The Daleks then fall off of the famous ghost ship, the Mary Celeste, I think it's pronounced, and then everyone arrives in a haunted house, and the Daleks fight off against Frankenstein and Dracula. Let me repeat that. The Daleks fight off against Frankenstein and Dracula. Wow. Well, technically they were robot versions of them in the far future of 1996, but that's just fun. If this story doesn't already sound bonkers, then we also have a robot doctor with a clickbait episode title, and the stunt double is painfully obvious. This may sound like I'm slagging off this story, however it is so ludicrous that I can't help but laugh. I love this story to bits, and end up in stitches after every watch. It also has the same benefit as The Keys of Marinus, where, despite being 6 parts, it changes the setting in almost every part and rarely gets boring. I do recommend this story, however I'd say that The War Machines is still a better recommendation, as The Chase can only be enjoyed if you go in with a very specific mindset. Despite all the comedy though, there's actually some great character moments. I'm specifically referring to Ian and Barbara's exit, as it is really, really good. At this point in the show, the First Doctor is never his rude and grumpy self again, except for when Ian and Barbara ask if they can go home by using the Dalek time machine. At first, the audience is confused and a bit annoyed at the Doctor for being mean. However, after the pair arrive and say the best line in the story,
We made it! I don't believe it. London 1965!
we see that the Doctor and Vicky were watching them leave, and then the Doctor says this one line which is able to perfectly explain why he acted rude.
I shall miss them. Yes, I shall miss them.
He didn't want to see them go. He knew he would miss them, so didn't want them to go. That is an absolutely great moment from his Doctor, and it comes full circle from the first episode, where he didn't want Ian and Barbara in the TARDIS at all. It is absolutely heartbreaking to hear, and it works really well, and this ending alone is what just nudges this story above the War Machines for now. Due to being a really fun watch and also having other layers to it, like a great companion exit, then I think this story earns its place in the top 4, and is in number 2 at the moment. It may change, however, number 1 will most likely stay at the top for a long time. No more memes, this is serious now, as I'm about to talk about my number 1. Okay, just one more meme.
Tonight, 4 celebrities must work as a team to win thousands of pounds to their chosen charities. There's just one thing standing in their way. The chaser. The chase is on.
So, the last 3 stories were all masterpieces for completely different reasons. Marco Polo is an incredibly beautiful character piece. The War Machines is an incredibly intense and thrilling watch which has stood the test of time. And The Chase is a hysterically fun story which is exactly my cup of tea, but also has some great character stuff underneath it all. Well, what if I were to tell you that my number 1 pick has all of those elements and more? You already know what it is from Process of Elimination, but my number 1 pick is The Daleks' Master Plan. This is my favourite classic story I've seen recently, so maybe Tomb or Inferno will beat it in future, but it is not hard to see why. Not only is it the best Hartnell story, not only is it the best classic Dalek story, not only is it perfectly paced despite having 12 episodes, but it also has one of the best First Doctor characters. Man in a Macintosh. This guy is absolutely incredible, and it's just, you feel the pain from him when his greenhouse gets moved by the rebels. He is incredible. I love this guy. Bring him back in the modern era. Just do something, but I'm obviously joking. Despite this being her only story, Sarah Kingdom is absolutely phenomenal in this, as she is kick-ass and just awesome. And so, I am left absolutely heartbroken by her death at the end, which may I say is absolutely brutal, due to Sarah being aged into dust. Not only does Sarah die, but Katerina, who only just joined in the Mythmakers, which was the previous story, ends up getting sucked out of an airlock, which is another brutal death. This was the first time in the show's history that they killed off a companion, and they did it twice! Even though I'm not too fussed on Katerina, I was still left heartbroken when she died because of how shocking it was and how somber the scene afterwards is, and I showed 10 times more emotion at her exit than I did at Vicky's. Says a lot. Even Brett Vian, who was the first performance of Nicholas Courtney in Who, and would later go on to play the always iconic Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart from the Web of Fear onwards, was killed by Sarah, who was his sister.
Shut up! Brett Vian was my brother.
Furthermore, the story ends on such a bleak note. The Daleks were defeated, but at what cost? That is when we get this brilliant line by Stephen.
Brett! Katerina!
Sarah. What a waste. What a terrible waste.
This is why this story is an incredible character piece. It is such a bleak, heartbreaking story, and you care about these characters who only stay for this story. You may be wondering how this story can be funny like The Chase, but it actually can. Episodes 7 to 10 are a lot more laid back compared to the other episodes, and I really like it as it allows the audience time to breathe after their heavy opener and before the even more heavy finale. Whilst there is an argument to be made that episode 7, The Feast of Stephen, is absolute dog shite and holds back the rest of the story from being a 10 or something, I actually disagree. Minus the obvious, I actually quite like it. It's pure dumb fun, even if the second half is unlistenable noise sometimes.
Did you see those two?
Furthermore, The Feast of Stephen is completely skippable and was made to be skippable, so people wouldn't miss anything with skipping it over at Christmas. Also, you can't go wrong with the ending.
Incidentally, a happy Christmas to all of you at home.
Even after The Feast of Stephen, the monk reappears in episode 8, which brings my attention right back, and he is easily the best part of the more comedic segment of the story, which mostly takes place in ancient Egypt. Whilst those episodes are not as laugh out loud funny as The Chase, it's still really enjoyable despite being the weakest episodes, and I'm only saying that because the rest of the story is so masterful. Now, I probably won't need to explain why this is an incredibly intense and thrilling watch, as I already mentioned that 2 companions die, and, well, it's also a Dalek story, so you can pretty much tell why it's an intense watch. Speaking of the Daleks, they are super menacing, and Marvick Chen is an absolutely phenomenal villain, Yellowface aside. I just can't get enough of Kevin Stoney in Who. Also, the threat of the Time Destructor, which is a weapon capable of aging planets into dust, is absolutely a really threatening plotline and keeps you hooked on the edge of your seat for all 5 hours of this story. Funny how a 12-parter, well, technically a 13-parter if you include Mission to the Unknown, which I don't, is infinitely better placed than the Web Planet, which is half the length. There is just so much good about this story that I'm bound to have missed something. Who knows, maybe I'll do an hour-long video talking about why this story is so great. But for now, I'm not sure how to end this segment, so here's a load of memorable quotes from the story.
I'm afraid, my friends, the Daleks have won. If the Daleks are doing something drastic, then we have to stop the Daleks. Now will you shut up, sir?
You make your incompetence sound like an achievement. The core is worthless.
No, it can't be. It came from Uranus. I know it did.
Funny.
So that was my ranking of all the Hartnell stories. I hope you enjoyed this video, as I sure as hell enjoyed making it and rewatching the Hartnell era. And if you'd like to see me rank all the Troughton stories, then please leave a like and comment that you would like to see Troughton. Also, feel free to rank all the Hartnell stories you have seen. I hope this video worked as a kind of guide on which stories to check out or give another go. Obviously, this ranking is just my silly personal opinion, and I would love to hear how different mine is to yours. If you want to see more of the First Doctor, or learn more about the many missing episodes, then I highly recommend watching Josh Snares' Missing Episode documentary, where he goes into detail on all the missing stories, as well as the best way to watch them today. In fact, just check out his whole channel. If you've been paying attention closely, you'll notice that I used a lot of clips from his channel, because it's just the go-to when it comes to anything 60s related. Furthermore, if you are all interested to see how well these stories did when they first aired, then I highly recommend watching Adam Martin's video on the viewing figures for the First Doctor's era, or you can go by season. Actually, even if you're not interested, still watch it as it's so good. I'd also like to give a quick thank you to Matt from the Universals, as he was kind enough to provide me with a Google Drive of all the Hartnell episodes, so I wouldn't have to waste my time screen recording them off Dailymotion. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to my channel to avoid missing any new uploads, including a Troughton ranking if I eventually do it. I hope I see you all again soon, and bye everyone. I never know how to end videos like this.
Goodbye, my dear.
Well, now that I've finished this mammoth video, I'm exhausted. I think this image sums up my current state very well.